Hi everyone, it's Alex from Risk Academy, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Graham Keith and to welcome all of you who are joining us live and who will watch this in replay or on the Risk Academy YouTube channel, where we will publish this as soon as we're done. So let's do very quick connection checks. If you can see, hear us, put ++ in the comment section, and we'll see that we are online. Now, Graham, there's a small delay in sounds how we hear each other and how everyone else is hearing us. So you'll see plus kind of coming in later in the conversation. Now. So everyone, thank you once again for joining. Today we've picked a very fascinating subject. We want to talk about the link or the opportunity to use risk analysis and some of the tools and techniques and the ideas that we have in risk management for the good of strategic planning. And strategic planning of all the business processes in the organization is a very sexy one, because first, it's highly uncertain. It usually goes in the 1, 2, 3, 5, 15 years forward. Huge uncertainty. So that sounds like a wonderful opportunity for to use our risk competencies in that process. The second element, it's highly material. I mean, the price of mistake is humongous. And of any studies that try to investigate what are some of the reasons why multi-billion-dollar corporations fail, is usually getting their strategy wrong. It's like, I think it's like 60% or something. Deloitte did a study called Value Killers, where they investigated 1,000 failures, and 60% of the time, approximately, I can't remember the exact number, are they completely missing the strategic risks and not reacting in time. So hugely material process. And then the final reason is we want to shine our risk competencies, and we want to show everyone in the organization just what we can do to add value to the organization. And if anything, strategic planning is the perfect opportunity, because everyone is involved. Even the board members sometimes get involved. I mean, when we were doing our strategy for the sovereign fund, we even had representatives from a couple of the ministries, as well as all the independent directors, as well as all the executives, as well as some of the board members. I mean, that was like the best opportunity ever to show what risk management is all about. So I think we've carefully selected strategic planning as a wonderful opportunity, and there's the whole different multiple ways of how risk can be integrated. So Graham, over to you. What's your experience? What's your approach? How would you tackle the link between risk management and strategic planning?
Yeah, so I think actually I'd almost take it a step further. We talk about sort of integrating risk management into strategy, but I've given a presentation. It's on the slideshare on LinkedIn, where I argue that risk management and strategy are basically the same thing. That what strategy is about managing uncertainty, or at least what it ought to be, is about managing uncertainty. And what risk management ought to be is very often isn't the case, but what risk management ought to be is about affecting or framing, influencing the fundamental decisions you're making, strategic decisions for the whole company, but also the individual decisions that managers make every day to try and make the company work. And so the goals are essentially the same. It's about making the right choices, understanding the objectives that you're trying to achieve, and managing the uncertainty in between. And I think if you look at the way sort of strategy is traditionally done, uncertainty is obviously part of it. It ought to be part of it, but it's very often it's sort of the wrong way around. I think we'll come back to that a little bit later on. The risk management is sort of done after the fact. But if you sort of take on uncertainty in the way that you do strategic planning, and then on the risk management side, I think very often risk management sort of forgets decision making. It's just like, well, there's all these risks, and for me, risk management should be, these are the decisions, these are the uncertainties, these are how we optimize these decisions in the face of all that uncertainty. So I think if you build in decision making into decision making and have an eye on the objectives, if you build that into risk management, which you ought to do, And if you take an explicit account of uncertainty in strategy, then they're basically the same thing. Now, where I was working before we set up this company in Maersk Oil, I actually took that on, and we built. I had a joint role in the strategy department, which was looking at the sort of strategic options, investment options, sort of portfolio management in terms of the investments that we could make, exploration, that sort of thing. And then also as head of enterprise risk, and it was a very conscious decision to try and unite those two things and make it work within the strategy department. So it might be that it doesn't work everywhere, but I think certainly for that size of company and with that sort of portfolio with very large amounts of uncertainty, it's a very natural way to think about it.
Mm-hmm. And picking up on on something you said, the strategy, the way it's meant to be. I mean, if we open any textbook on strategic planning or any training on strategic planning, surely some level of uncertainty is already taken into account. I mean, the traditional tools on SWOT analysis, sensitivity analysis that they perform, some level of uncertainty, some level of risk is already taken into account. But why is it not always, or why is it not enough? What's that missing opportunity for the risk to get involved and add additional value to what the strategy department is already kind of doing?
Yeah. Okay. So I think first it's quite a difficult thing to talk about, because I mean we're talking about strategy in a very general sense, and there are billions of different kinds of, well, probably millions of different companies, millions of different kinds of companies, all sorts of different shapes and sizes, different focuses, different amounts of uncertainty in what they're dealing with. So I think it's difficult to sort of generalize. I think actually, honestly, it's even harder than that, because when you sort of get out into the literature to say, what is strategy? There's remarkably little agreement on what strategy is. That said, I think what happens a lot with strategy is they sort of get it the wrong way around. Strategy is essentially about making choices. It's about making strategic choices, where you want to be, what you want to be playing at, how, and then obviously the objectives as well, what it is you're trying to achieve. And I think generally what happens is people will make a set of choices in order to achieve some objectives. A lot of the strategy I see that there's not a very sort of clear connection between the choices and objectives. You say, these are our objectives, these are our choices. And then you think, okay, well, how do those choices affect those objectives? We'll come back to that in a minute. But I think then what they say is that they make the choices, and often those choices are based on the kind of company we want to be, and who are we, and these sort of, slightly rhetorical, not sort of terribly well framed sort of decisions about what we want to do and be. You make the choices on the basis of whatever gut feeling, management, leadership kind of macho thing you do. Mm-hmm. You have your objectives, which is generally to be the best or world leading or whatever. And then you do risk analysis afterwards. And for me, that's strange, because, my background is mathematics. So I sort of come at this and I look at it and I say, okay, look, we have objectives that we want to achieve or we want to optimize in some way. We're looking to sort of be the best we can in some metric. We have a bunch of levers that we can pull on, sort of decision levers. Mm-hmm. This is an optimization problem. It's a stochastic optimization problem, because we have all this uncertainty in the middle. So instead of making the choices and then looking at how the uncertainties might sort of knock us off course, what we should do is look at the uncertainties and use that to make the choice. And I think that's where the opportunity is. So what it's about is about, understanding the uncertainties and how our decisions propagate through those uncertainties and affect our objectives. And I think that's the opportunity, and that's what you don't see so much of. And I think one of the ways you see this is that very often what you'll get when you look at a strategy is a model. So you have, this is our model, this is our forecast, these are our projections, this is what we're going to achieve, we've got this ROIC, we've got this EBIT, whatever. And then we've got a list of the things that might knock us off course. So it's a sort of deterministic financial model, and then a sort of qualitative, some semi-qualitative, whatever, risk picture. Yeah. And I think what we're trying to do is to sort of turn that around a bit and say, what we want is we want to understand the full uncertainty picture, and then optimize the decisions against that full uncertain variable.
Which is fascinating because, I mean, as you mentioned, you have background in mathematics. So what you're saying, makes total sense to a person who has the necessary competencies to understand that. But you've probably lost some of the listeners right now. I will try and reiterate that. I mean, I obviously worked a lot with our strategy department, and what I have seen initially, and I think this is what you're trying to say, is that first they come up with the strategic model for the company. This is what we're going to do. This is the direction we're taking. These are some of the assumptions that we've put into our overall model. And then once the kind of general direction is set, they run some risk analysis, usually in the form of sensitivity analysis, as an afterthought, saying, are we okay? And unfortunately, because the underlying one of the objectives for the strategy department is to deliver the strategy on time, they would actually carefully select the level of sensitivity that they want to test to make sure everything still looks okay. Even if it doesn't, they're not gonna rattle the cage too much. So in the traditional risk management, in traditional strategic planning, the company decides on the strategy, puts all the numbers in, calculates the cash flow, says this is how quickly we will achieve the objectives. By the way, most of the time, not taking the necessary steps to de-bias the experts that come up with all the assumptions. So there's an element of optimism, and sometimes a huge element of optimism built into the strategy. And then as an afterthought, they run some very, very basic risk analysis, either SWOT analysis or sensitivity analysis, and saying, yep, we've checked it, we've done our risk, we've done the due diligence, it still holds. And we will deliver that. Because a couple of times and what you're trying to say is that actually, before you set the general direction and you agree on everything, you should actually add volatility to it and start shaking the strategy before it's almost pre-final version. Because a couple of times we actually did that. Well, first we discovered that all of the risk management that the strategy department was doing was super optimistic, was not highlighting even the tip of the iceberg of the real issues. And what we also discovered is when we started adding volatility to the model and run it on the first, which was considered pre-final version, the probability of achieving one of the objectives was less than 1%.
Yeah.
That means there's a 99.999 something percent probability that the strategy will not be achieved. So I obviously presented it to the executive saying, are you sure you want to take this strategy to the board and to the ministries? And they said, well, obviously not.
Yeah.
So they ended up completely rewriting the strategy, which should have been done. They should have never even seen that version with a 99% failure rate.
Yeah. I think you touch on a lot of issues, and I totally recognise that experience that you've had there. I think just to kind of, I think there's several levels to take this at, and I think even before, I think right at the beginning you said, we both have mathematical backgrounds, so this is sort of comfortable territory for us. And one of the challenges that we have is sort of selling this notion to people who maybe don't have the sort of detailed probability and statistics. But I think in the first instance, the very sort of first step, the top level, is trying to understand. I mean, I think it's a very big step just to say, look, what are we trying to achieve, and what are the decisions we're going to make? And then trying to sort of map out that causal relationship between your decisions, your objectives, and then the things that you can't control, the sort of the fundamental uncertainties that fit into that. And I think once you map that out, and that's a very powerful process in itself. And actually, I think a very important part of what we do is sort of sitting down with people and trying to understand what influences what's the relationship between these variables. Also trying to understand what can we measure in this, and that's useful for monitoring and for executing, but it's also useful for gathering data to sort of tune the model. But I'm going too far, because what I'm really interested in here is sort of understanding the relationships and the uncertainties and how they play it. That's for me the first stage. And I think even at that stage, you can start building strategies that are robust, that say, okay, if this happens here, then we'll go in this direction. If this happens here, we'll do this direction. It doesn't necessarily have to be sort of deeply quantitative. I mean, obviously, I passionately believe that until you put numbers on the table, that your understanding is a sort of meager and thin kind. You really do need to kind of do that modeling. I think it's a very important discipline. But actually, to be honest, when in that dialogue with the senior management of the company, so much value is there, just understanding what decisions are, understanding what the uncertainties are, understanding what the objectives are, and thinking in those terms. And then trying to build that.
Is there a particular technique or a diagram that you can use to map out the relationships?
Yeah. So I have in my former life, I did a lot of causal analysis on machinery failure, actually. And there's a lot of sort of very powerful machinery available. Some of it's quite old. It goes back to sort of Victorian philosophers like John Stuart Mill. And there's a lot of sort of how do we think about cause and effect? We're looking at objectives with something that we're trying to achieve. That's the effect that we're trying to influence by intervening, by making the decisions that we make. And that causal language, I think, is a very natural way to describe making decisions, setting parameters, and then understanding how they propagate through the uncertainties and affect the objectives that we want to have. So I think that's a big part of the approach that I try to bring when we're thinking about strategy and thinking about also risk management in general, and also modeling for decision making and so on. It's really sort of starting with the objectives and then sort of synthesizing out the factors that go into sort of achieving those objectives, and then sort of working backwards towards the decisions, but at the same time starting with the decisions and working forward through that causal chain, and then sort of trying to understand that sort of network of causal relations in between. And I think that's a very natural thing. It's quite interesting because one of the things that's difficult about this is that we're working a lot with uncertainty, and human beings, there's a lot of literature about this, human beings are terrible at understanding uncertainty. I mean, our intuition about uncertainty is horrid. It's useless, and I don't think that's something we should be ashamed of. I think it's not because we're stupid. It's not because we weren't concentrating hard enough at school. It's because when you deal with the way you learn, the way you develop intuition is you deal with the system, you get feedback from the system, and then you train your intuition. But the problem is when you deal with an uncertain system, you get different feedback all the time. And it's only when you've interacted with it a couple of hundred times that you actually start beginning to understand what that picture is looking like. But you can't develop intuition on the basis of that. And because you can't develop intuition about a single uncertain system, it's very difficult to develop intuition about uncertain systems in general. So our intuition about uncertainty is pants. On the other hand, we have this fantastically beautiful, well-developed mathematical theory for modeling uncertainty. On the other hand, our intuition about causality is fantastic because that's how we work, that's how we survive. We understand, we have systems, we understand causal relations, we intervene in those systems in order to optimize things for ourselves. And we've been doing that since the dawn of time. So we're very good intuition and causality, but it's only recently, really, I think, that we're beginning to sort of develop the tools that we need to be able to do that. And I think a lot of what we're trying to do here, both in a risk management context and in a strategy context, is to try to use the powerful intuition that we have understanding causal relations to sort of make up for our lack of intuition on the probability side, and then use the sort of mathematical machinery from probability to make up for the lack of useful modeling tools that we have on the causal side. Yeah, I mean, short answer to your question, what's the tool? Causal mapping, that's the tool.
I mean, weirdly, some of the, I don't know if it's a coincidence or if maybe it means something, but some of the better tools on that come from either CIA or Pentagon, and one of the tools that I highly recommend is called influence diagrams.
Yeah.
And the other tool, and just Google influence diagrams. It's a technique that is highly powerful in understanding the interconnections between different uncertain assumptions and the strategic objectives. And then the other one, of course, which is the CIA use, it's called key assumption check. Again, it's a very simple, none of this is quantitative yet. This is just drawing pictures. But because our brain is structured, I guess, in a way that is really good at drawing pictures, not really good at understanding the uncertain probabilities, what you're referring, again, what you're saying is absolutely obvious to someone who studied this, but you're talking about system 1 and system 2 thinking that Daniel Kahneman got with Vernon Smith a Nobel Prize for in economics in 2002 or 12. I keep forgetting.
True.
So the other tool, again, Google it. The beauty is that CIA is actually making a lot of this stuff public. Google key assumption check. There is a very nice small document from CIA that has a description on how to use it, and on if you want to learn more about system 1 or system 2 thinking and why intuition is not our ally when it comes to probability, obviously check out the book by Daniel Kahneman. And sorry, I usually say that at the very beginning, but let me just reiterate it here very quickly. None of what we are talking about with Graham right now is groundbreakingly new. This has been around for decades, and I've just posted a link in the comment section with the list of books that have talked about this for years. I update this list from time to time as when I read a new book and I found it truly groundbreaking in my development. But all of this stuff is there, and so is Kahneman's book Thinking Fast and Slow is there, and so is Gagarin's book Risk Savvy, which is a slightly different school of intuition on intuition and risk perception. So highly recommended looking into some of those studies.
Did I just come in there, Alex?
Yeah.
A couple of things. Do you have Daniel Pearl's book on causality? I think we've talked about that.
Not yet, because I'm just reading it.
Okay, fair enough. It's interesting. I think you're absolutely right with influence diagrams. And what I was talking about with the causal mapping, a causal map and an influence diagram are essentially the same things. There's a bit more theory around causal relations than influence relations, and allowing that little extra discipline, little extra strictness in how you define those relations opens up opportunities to do a bunch of tricks. And those tricks are to do with sort of understanding how you can once you build those causal relations, if you're a little bit strict about the relationships, and it allows you to filter the causal map for what's important and what isn't important. Again, not in a mathematical way, not in a probabilistic way, but just in a what is actually on the causal chain between the decision and the objective. And the other thing that allows you to do is to understand causal relationships and correlative relationships, so that you don't run into the sort of tail wagging the dog situation where you sit there hacking away at a KPI because you think it's going to improve your objectives, whereas actually your KPI is yes, it's correlated with your objectives, but actually the causal element that influences it is something else, and it's really that you should be hacking away on. So I think influence diagrams are fantastic, and I think influence diagrams, when you work through the sort of theory around them, are so close to causal mapping that it doesn't matter. If you're not comfortable using CIA stuff, a lot of this theory is also developed in medicine. There's a lot of work in sort of medical biostatistics about how to understand causal relationships and bring causal understanding to a model so that you can interrogate the data more meaningfully and also exactly understand how interventions will change outcomes. And we're sourcing a lot of that material.
Yeah, and this is, and I mean, basically what we're trying to say is, in order to integrate risk management and strategic planning properly, first we use a number of analytical tools where we're trying to map relationships or causal relationships. And this, again, this will uncover a lot. Like, this will already add significant insight to the traditional strategic planning process. But then once we move on from that, is we can use key assumption check. Once we identify all the assumptions, all those factors or decisions or uncertainties or risks that affect our objectives, once we identify them, we can actually recalculate this strategy using some of the more mathematical tools to support, not just provide kind of a graphical insight, but actually provide mathematical evidence to support our claims that this strategy is either good or not good, or if it's not good, how can it be made better? And what are some of the techniques or tools that you would use there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, maybe back up a stage there.
Yeah.
I think what very often happens with when we're building these models, and this is sort of going back to what you were talking about earlier about sort of strategy departments that build a single model, and that model tends to be very optimistic. I think there's a sort of fallacy there that says that when you have when you have uncertainty, the way to deal with that is to try to find, it's too complex to deal with the uncertainty. So we have we've got all these maps and stuff, and then we're saying, well, but we need to simplify, and then that the urge to simplify ends up in essentially ignoring the uncertainty and trying to find a single model that is somehow illustrative or representative of the relations that are there, and then using your understanding of the uncertainties to sort of say, okay, well, what can knock this model off course? And it might be that in some industries with very little uncertainty, I can't find it hard to come up with an example. Maybe some sort of state-driven stuff where you have sort of long timescales and things will definitely happen. I don't know, but there might be that's okay in some circumstances. But certainly in the industries I've worked in, it's not. And essentially what you're talking about here is a sort of floor of averages where you're saying, okay, I'm just going to take some illustrative value for all of these unknowns and then build a model on the basis of that. And what's interesting here is that when you start sort of combining those base cases, they're usually optimistic good cases. They don't really sort of take in the downside. And then when you put them all together, you end up with these incredibly rosy, shiny examples that are just absolutely, when you do the uncertainty analysis properly, you can't see. Again, from my perspective, when you build the causal diagram, what a causal diagram is, or an influence diagram for that sake, it's actually a picture of a mathematical model, because the connections in those causal diagrams are basically saying, I have a variable here, which is somehow dependent on the variable down here. So I'm going to have an equation here, which has this variable as one of its arguments. Mm-hmm. So it becomes, and actually, if I'm absolutely honest, when I'm doing this modeling, I usually do the equations first and then produce the causal map. But it's usually a more comfortable way to work with other people to make the causal map and then to build the equations. And then when you're doing that, you very, very naturally fall into a sort of, it doesn't necessarily have to be a sort of Monte-Carlo simulation, although it very quickly becomes it. 10 years ago, I'd have said, let's try and sort of understand these relationships, build a mathematical model, see if we can't do something sensible with it without just jumping straight into Monte-Carlo. But these days, Monte-Carlo is so fast, it's so easy to build, and it's a very, very natural...
Sorry? And free.
Yeah, and it's a very natural progression from the understanding that you get by building those influence diagrams, causal maps, whatever you want to call them. So I think that's, for me, it comes very naturally. I mean, you build that model, you write down those equations, and then you run the model. But I think, again, coming back to what you're saying about causal maps not being mathematical and really just being sort of pictures and tools for conversation, I think that's absolutely right. And I think one of the things that's very powerful about them is that it allows us to background the mathematics. So we sit down and we say, these are the relationships. These are, and then the next stage is actually to say, okay, we need data on these things. We need to populate these nodes. We need to understand what these uncertainties look like. What's the sort of range of outcomes? We need to understand the functional relationships. There's a whole bunch of work to do with experts, with data as far as possible to sort of, build that model. But in terms of the actual sort of, probability, convolution, running Monte-Carlo, how you do that, I think the great thing about the influence diagram is that people are actually fairly comfortable to just leave that to the mathematical experts. And it's not easy. I mean, you need a fair amount of sort of mathematical education to be able to build one of these things. But I think people at that point, they're saying, okay, I understand how this works. I understand the data that's coming in. I understand how the data can come in, can describe this variable. I understand the relationships. And now I'm happy for you to go and build that and then show me what the outcomes look like and show me how changing the decisions, changing the parameters in the control box will affect the outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And I think based on what you've just said, I think I can even map it into 3 steps. Step number 1, understand the causes and the relationships in the strategy. And that's where a causal map or an influence diagram is helpful. Now that almost immediately leads to the identification of the key assumptions. What are some of the inputs or assumptions that were used to build this current model, that strategic model that the strategy department has put together? And this is where the key assumption check from the CIA comes in, because you go through each of the assumptions and you say, well, do I trust this source? Is this verifiable? Can we use it? Is this an uncertain assumption? And naturally, most of the time you would say, okay, some things I don't trust, that means the uncertainty is higher. Some things I trust, so that means uncertainty is relatively small. But there's always uncertainty. And that's why most business plans and strategies are not realistic, because you've even mentioned it. I mean, Sam Savage calls it the flow of averages, which, by the way, is an amazing book, also on the list. Make sure you read it. But he actually refers to what mathematical Jensen's inequality, which basically says if you're using single point estimates, especially if you use most likely or the averages, you've basically cut out 50% of the positives and 50% of the negatives, and what you're left with is a completely unrealistic picture of the future, which just ignores the whole nature of uncertainty. And yet we know for a fact future is uncertain, and the longer we look into the future, the more uncertain it is. So we've just deleted uncertainty from this picture of the future world, which makes it just basically nonsense. But that's how strategic planning and budgeting and investment planning and forecasting works in most of the cases where risk management, proper risk management is not used. So by adding volatility to some of the key assumptions, we can then simulate or run scenarios and say, not this is one version of the future, but we can show 3 or 10,000. It doesn't really matter whether we use scenario analysis or Monte-Carlo simulation. But these are the 3 steps. Step number 1, graphical representation, causal maps or influence diagrams. Step number 2, once you identify the assumptions, verify that they're real and add volatility to each of the assumptions. Step number 3, simulate what will happen to the strategy if that uncertainty happens. And the level of insight that we get compared to the traditional strategy that the strategic department usually puts, where they show 3 scenarios and saying, yeah, everything's fine, let's do it, we will achieve the objectives. I mean, the level of insight is just mind-blowing. I mean, it was just absolutely amazing.
This is a very new experience for me. This is the first time ever that I haven't been the first one to mention Jensen's inequality. Someone else beat me to it. But it's a very, very important point. It's a very subtle mathematical point, but it's a very, very important point. It's very, very interesting, and we see it all the time. Those sort of single point, idealistic, illustrative, deterministic models are usually enormously optimistic, and one of the huge advantages of the sort of uncertainty modeling that we're talking about is that it allows you to really understand where a sort of realistic outcome is, in terms of, especially when you're sort of amalgamating lots of different things that are going on. Where does that actually meet, and what is the uncertainty around it? There are a lot of other upsides to it. I think one of the things that it's absolutely impossible to, if you have a sort of deterministic model with a risk picture around it, or a register or whatever, you can't really have a sensible conversation about risk and reward. You can't say, okay, I got risks here, and risk is also taken very negatively. So, what about this? We could, and again, coming from the oil industry, we talk a lot about oil price. It's one of our big uncertainties, and we're saying, well, the oil price could tank, and then we're stuffed. Or you say, well, yeah, but the whole reason we're in this game is we're looking for those oil price upsides. We're looking for those big technical discoveries that allow us to sort of capitalize on that. And it's very difficult to have that conversation unless you're doing the kind of analysis that we're talking about, that's saying, we think there's an upside here. Is the upside that we see, is that warranted? Does that warrant the risk that we know that we're going to take? And I think it's absolutely impossible to have that conversation in any kind of meaningful way without the sort of analysis that we're talking about.
Yep.
Sure.
And what you raise is a very, very powerful message, because with the kind of, I don't want to call it traditional, but with the ERM type risk discussion, you have all these wonderful fairy tale promises from the strategy department, and you're trying to counteract it with the negative, horrible tales of doom from the risk management department, which of course is a losing battle, because I mean, just from a perception point of view, of course executives like the prettier pictures, then they want to talk about the downside all the time. But that's not what risk management is all about. I mean, this is why ERM is such a flawed concept, because it highlights the risks, and you're trying to counteract that against the objectives that the strategy put. But in reality, when you use proper scenarios or simulations, you actually, when you add volatility to the assumptions, you don't just add bad volatility to the assumptions, you add volatility in general. That means you're saying, yes, the interest rates may go up or down, which will be super beneficial for the company because it has a lot of leverage, and it has a lot of loans in its portfolio. Or the oil price may go up, which will be very nice, or may go down. You actually simulate the whole range of possible scenarios, and that's why you show that yes, there's sometimes. I mean, I've actually, a friend of mine was doing risk modeling for one of the huge projects in the Middle East, oil projects, and they went with this strategy that had 16% chance of being achieved. Because the upside was so huge, the management consciously decided to take the risk. I mean, can you imagine? 16%.
Actually, it's not that hard to imagine, because we take that kind of bet a lot in the oil industry. I mean, if you look at, some of those when you're sort of chasing very, very big fields, your chance of finding anything is relatively small, and then the chance of being able to sort of put the infrastructure and everything else together is very, very small. But the upside is absolutely enormous, and then you're into a sort of portfolio effect, and that's something else that I think is accessible through the kind of analysis that we're talking about, that isn't accessible through this sort of deterministic, because again, you run into this Jensen's inequality floor of averages problem. It's not actually the floor of averages. The problem is that when you build base cases for a bunch of stuff that you're trying to put together in a portfolio, all those base cases, ideal cases, best cases, whatever you want to call them, they tend to be incredibly optimistic, and they tend to have a lot of downside risks, but are not actually that much upside risk, because they're built for a sort of certain level of optimization, and it's actually difficult very often to sort of pick up the upside, but the downside is all there. So it's very difficult. First, you can't really add these things up because they're not averages; they're something usually very optimistic, so you can't add them up. And actually, as you add them up, the more you add them up, the more insanely optimistic they become. So there's no aggregation possibility in that sort of deterministic ERM model. You have to be doing uncertainty analysis in order to be able to amalgamate. But the other thing with portfolio that you get when the kind of analysis we're talking about is you understand how the risks relate to each other. And then you can do things like construct portfolios that give you a line of sight to a big upside, but at the same time protect you on a year-for-year basis. Because if you're going in making the kind of bet that you're talking about, where there's a 16% chance of success, frankly, 16% is not bad, actually. But if you do a lot of that kind of thing, then you run the risk of going a year or two without any win at all. Now, it might be in your third year, it comes home and it pays for everything. And that's essentially how the oil industry works. But if you've got shareholders who are interested in seeing a return year on year, then you need to make sure that your downside is protected. So what we do is we construct portfolios that give you a line of sight to upside, but protect your sort of year on year downside. There's no way you can do that with a bunch of deterministic models. It would be wrong, and it would be silly, and you wouldn't be able to understand how the individual uncertainties that are affecting the different outcomes were interacting together. And that's a huge advantage of this model. It sounds terribly complicated. I'm worried that when we talk about it, people will be sitting there going, "Oh, yeah, that sounds great," but there's no way we'd be able to understand that. But again, I think you can, because I think once you understand those relationships, then you can sort of black box the sort of detailed mathematics a little bit. What's important is what's going into those boxes. How do things relate to each other? What are the relationships? And that's a dialogue. That's something that comes out of a discussion with a lot of different stakeholders, and that's very important.
Yeah. Absolutely. Let me read out. We have a couple more questions that we want to discuss, but let me read out the questions. And sorry, but just before I do that, because the reality is, I mean, this is probably the second most complex in terms of comprehension webinar that I've run out of dozens of webinars that I've done. So let me just reiterate. Step number one, graphical representation of relationships and causes and dependencies between the different inputs and the objectives. In a model, that's your influence diagrams or causal maps. Step number two, once you identified what the key assumptions are that go into the strategy, validate them using key assumption check, for example. And step number three, once you have the list of different assumptions that go into the strategy, none of these assumptions is actually a single point estimate, unlike or despite what the kind of the most strategic planning professionals put in the models. None of them are actually single numbers because it's all forecasts about the future. So they're ranges, and we replace them with ranges, and we then run scenarios or simulations to see how the uncertainty affects and changes our objectives. And what usually happens is you end up with a completely different strategy compared to kind of your initial version. So that's a very simplified version of our discussion, and I'll share, and Graham will share some links to additional information. Let me quickly go through the question. So Rajiv is asking, what's our view on companies like Samsung, Airbus, and Boeing? Do you think they integrate risks while they're planning strategies? I mean, I'm going to take an easy answer on that. I haven't worked with either one of them, so I wouldn't know. And I probably wouldn't want to speculate what they actually do. The ones I did work with, large multi-billion-dollar sovereign funds, I found that strategies were overly optimistic, and when we added risk analysis to it, it significantly changed the final outcome. The version that went, version 17 or version 24 of the strategy that went before the approval was very, very different after we've run our risk analysis.
If I just come in on that, I have the same answer. I mean, I don't know. You need to work with those companies or in those companies to really understand. I think something that's very important is that a lot of companies have a very different. They have a sort of, they have a story about strategy that they present to the public and to shareholders, and then they have their internal strategy. And sometimes those are very different. And often the external strategy will be incredibly simplified, and often to the point of actually not really being a strategy at all, more being a sort of description of what it is the company.
Vision, mission.
Yeah, and then some warm air around vision, mission sort of stuff. But then actually those same companies, when you get into those companies and you look at actually what has been communicated and cascaded through their management structure, how are decisions made, what are their KPIs, how are they governed, that sort of thing, it's a lot more sophisticated. I find it very, very difficult to believe that a company like Boeing or Samsung or anyone like that wouldn't be doing that in a fairly sophisticated way. They certainly have the mathematical chops within the organizations to be able to do that. But you won't necessarily see that when you read their annual report or you read their strategy or you go onto their website and see their pages. And that's one of the challenges of doing strategies. You sit down to do a strategy with a company and then you say, okay, let's look at all the strategies for companies similar. And there's actually, unless you're lucky and you're able to see what is actually going on internally, it's very difficult to really sort of get a sense of what they're doing in terms of their decision making, unless you're actually part of that company.
Yeah, and this kind of leads us to the next question by Odwa, and she's asking, what's your advice for internal audit to help change the organizational culture in terms of integrating into the daily business runnings and decision making and so on, because what you've just described is, and I want people to very clearly understand that what you see in the public domain is risk management 1, which means it's a sugar-coated version of whatever the company is actually doing, and no company will ever disclose what they actually do for their decision making. We're talking about risk management 2. How do you internally integrate into strategic planning, and what tools do you need to use to add value to the process? But reality is, and we've kind of avoided it, strategy, while it's a highly uncertain, highly material, very high profile process, it's also extremely sensitive. I mean, that's the kind of the fourth element of it. Highly sensitive, very intimate, I would even say, because some part of the strategy is politics, where people will want to protect their own budgets, and they don't care what the uncertainty is. It's all about distribution of power within the organization. Highly sensitive, very intimate process. And I don't think there's kind of a single recipe for how do you change the mindset, how do you, integrate into it. Any thoughts, advice on that, and then I'll share some of my ideas as well.
Yeah, so I think it's quite a difficult question to answer in general. It depends very much what the company is doing and how big the company is and players involved in it. Very often, companies are required to produce risk registers and heat maps and so on. And there's legislative requirements to do that, and I think that's quite difficult to mess with. And actually, in many respects, the sort of thing that Alex and I are talking about today is sort of understanding what are your objectives, what are your decision making, what are the uncertainties, how do we find our way in those uncertainties, how do our decisions affect our objectives. You can almost come at it in some areas, in some departments, without calling it risk analysis or without calling it risk management, and just sort of sidestep that whole sort of political discussion around, what's the risk department doing, what's the other department doing, and go into a company and say, or go into a situation and say, okay, look, these are the decisions that we're looking to make. This is what we're trying to optimize. This is what we're trying to achieve. Having that discussion about the influences and what are the factors here, and building that up at some level, and then what data do we have? What data do we have? Historical data do we have? What public available data do we have? What can we use to sort of condition this model? And then make it actually more about decision quality and more about improving decision making. Yes, you will be doing risk management in the sense that you are managing uncertainties and you are making decisions under uncertainty. But I think sometimes you can avoid some of the politics by just not calling it risk management and just actually making the focus on decision making. I realize that if your remit is risk management, that's not going to help you very much, because of course you come with your risk management hat on and people are going to say you're doing risk management. But I think it is, because I think what you're doing here is you're saying, and actually that first step, that simple diagram is saying, what are the decisions? What are the what are the objectives? And then what does it look like in between? So one of the beauties of influence diagrams, causal maps, whatever it is that they're scalable. It's one of the beauties of it. It's also the art. It's also what's difficult about it, because what you have to do is you have to get the level of granularity right. So every decision influence diagram is basically decision, things you control, things you don't control, and then there's an arrow that goes from things you don't control into things you do control, because you don't have complete control over those things, and there's an arrow that goes from things you don't control up into objectives, and hopefully there's a thing that goes from things you control up to objectives. That's your first influence diagram. And then you can unpack those things and split them out into different categories and split them out into different variables. And you can keep unpacking. I mean, one of the problems with causal analysis is it's hard to know when to stop. You can make causal things incredibly complicated. And at each level of granularity, it's a different way of thinking about it. So typically when they're lumped together, you're looking for similar things, and you're looking kind of to try to condition those models with things that you've seen in other places. And then the more granular you get, the more you get into the little detail, the more mechanical the model comes. But the first, just understanding the decisions, the objectives, what the basic uncertainties are, as Alex said a number of times, the key assumptions that's going into that, it's incredibly powerful. It really helps focus the mind. It really helps understand what it is you're worrying about. It means that you understand where you need to focus your attention, what work you need to be doing. And I think, but actually, in many respects, I think it's easier to make that pitch as a sort of enhancement of decision quality rather than as a risk management thing, because risk management has so much baggage attached to it. You come and say, I'm going to do risk management. Everyone's expecting you to sort of sit down and make a big risk register and have a big session about what the risks are. They're expecting you to make heat maps. They're expecting you to make registers. They're expecting you to do quarterly reviews. And you're not really doing any of that. One thing you are doing, I think that's a very important discipline from risk management that we need to port into this. When you build that causal map, you need to have everything that can affect the outcome. And that's something that risk managers are quite good at. We have a lot of processes for surfacing all the things that could have an effect. Yeah. And again, it's not necessarily the things that had effect last year or even the last 10 years. It could be something that hasn't happened yet. So we need to be able to tease those out. That's a very important discipline. But I think if you come with the risk manager, then you generate an awful lot of expectation that you're actually not looking to fulfill.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned decision quality. Surprise, surprise. There's a book called Decision Quality. It's in the link that I've provided. Must read for all the risk managers. I mean, that's a very powerful sales point. Another one, of course, is the question from Odwa comes from an internal audit perspective, but internal audit is super powerful because making a recommendation that strategy should be risk-based, just planting that little seed to allow the risk manager then to come in and say, well, this is how we do it. Here are the ideas. I mean, internal auditors were my best friends, always, because I would write all the recommendations that they would later publish under the kind of the internal audit brand. But then later I would come in and say, this is how you do it. You've got the internal audit recommendation. But another advice on how to kind of make that shift for me was I read through all the legislation and the guidelines that our company decided to comply with. And I literally, in one of the Ministry of Economics guidelines, which was not even a law, it was a recommended guideline, I found, and this is literally the reason why we've changed the strategic planning process. I found one sentence which said when publishing a strategy, the company should run scenarios or something. Like it was some obscure sentence. And it was especially hilarious because we were working in a large government organization, so we would see all those guidelines before they were finalized. So the head of strategy sends it to me, goes, "Do you want me to delete this sentence? Because they will come to you." I'm going, no, I want that sentence in. So anyway, 2 years later, that document is published, and I found that sentence, and I literally went to everyone, to the CFO, saying, look, they want us to do scenarios. Why don't you outsource this little scenario analysis to us? We will run 10,000 scenarios because we've got nothing better to do, and we've got all the competency and the tools. And he goes, yeah, fine, do whatever. And we ended up changing the whole strategy just because of that little sentence. I had that. I just needed this little window to get in, and once I've done, the insight from risk analysis was so groundbreaking that we ended up rewriting the document. So sometimes you don't need a lot. Now Chris is asking the next question: is there a document table template that shows how to integrate risk into strategic planning? And do you want to start answering that? I'll send my article on that.
I think you should send your article on that. I think your article on that is very good. I think. I think that's a very succinct summary of what it is that you need to do. I think it checks the points off nicely. I see we're running a little bit out of time because I think we could have quite an interesting conversation. Maybe we should have another webinar about this at some other point. But I think our approach is very similar to yours. We have slightly different emphases in the sense that I think if I remember rightly, you start off with sort of how is it you say it's decomposing the objectives. I think you say.
Which is actually as I wrote this in 2011. And I've since realized that what I was trying to do was actually an influence diagram. But
exactly. So I think, and that's actually our first step is this idea that you start with the decisions and the objectives. And that doesn't mean that they're fixed. I mean, one of the big, really useful things about this exercise is that you write down a bunch of decisions and you write down a bunch of objectives. And then once you've gone through and understood what you can control, what you can't control, and you've had those conversations about it, you very often end up changing those things because you find more natural ways of interacting with your environment. So where you have decomposing objectives, I think we have decision, objective, and then the causal map in between. I think the other thing that I think I would add to what you have there is, which you've touched on a lot today with the key assumptions, is really understanding the data, understanding what you have to condition this model. It's interesting. A lot of the decision quality literature is actually quite thin on how do you, they're promoting model building of various types, but they're quite, light on how do you check that your model is actually a decent model and is doing what you use. It's quite fun. You sit there and you go, well, I can make this decision, the objectives will look like this. And, it could be absolute nonsense what you've got in between there. So it's very, very important that you're understanding what your model predicts, and then you're using data to compare what your model predicts with what's happened in the past so that you can condition your model and make it good. But also you need to be able to understand what the model is telling you when you're looking at KPIs. And we sort of talked about this a little bit earlier on. So I think that is the sort of nailing your model to reality. And when I talk about model, I'm essentially talking about the influence diagram. Nailing that to reality by having data and having predictions and comparing them is a very important aspect. But otherwise, I think we're absolutely aligned on that. I think that's a great little article.
Absolutely great.
Super place to start.
Jake is asking at the moment, that's the last question we have. Jake is asking, how do you get past the culture of seeing strategic risk as separate silo from op risk, cyber, and whatever? Do you want to have a stab at answering that?
Yeah, it's difficult. I think so. As I said, I think we've mentioned this earlier on. What we tried to do at Maersk was we put enterprise risk in the strategy department, and what that did was it meant that the sort of reporting structure for the operational risk ended up going into the strategy department. Now, I think it's an interesting discussion. This, where does risk belong? And I think one of the reasons we wanted to put risk into strategy was because when it sat in operations, the enterprise risk really wasn't capturing financial risks, strategic risks, market risks, commodity risks, all this sort of thing. And then when it sat in finance, it wasn't really capturing the operational. And instead, strategy was a sort of neutral place where we could draw in from all sides, from finance, from strategy, obviously from ops, from all of these places, and put it together. So I think finding that sort of neutral location and then the framework that allows that information to come in. One of the enormously frustrating things that I've experienced, luckily not so much in the companies I work for, but in other companies, is where you have operational departments doing very, very sophisticated risk analysis of the type that Alex and I are talking about today, and then being required to take that very sophisticated analysis, essentially throw it out of the window in order to be able to sort of place the risk in a very, very simplified risk framework. So I think the key elements here are finding the sort of neutral location, the sort of political mid-zone, if you like, and then having a framework that allows people, that doesn't require people to throw away information that they've worked incredibly hard to develop.
And to kind of pick up on your answer, so positioning risk management within the company is one way to overcome that kind of culture of siloing risk. But in reality, I mean, it really depends on what you see the kind of the main objective of risk management is. And to me, when we talk about strategic risk versus operational risk versus cyber or financial risk, to me, that's a pretty much dead giveaway that we're still thinking in the risk management 1 mindset. Because in risk management 2 mindset, and obviously there's an article on what is risk management 1 and 2. It's on Risk Academy. Find it, or I'll find it and post it later. But in the risk management 2 mindset, risk management is a decision-making tool. So there are no cyber risks, there are no financial risks, there are no operational risks. There are different types of decisions, and strategy is basically just a very straightforward optimizing decision at the strategic level. It has, by the way, when you drill down to all the inputs and assumptions, it has strategic market assumptions, it has operational assumptions, it has financial assumptions, it has cyber assumptions. All of that is inside the decision. And the same with operational. I mean, when you have another optimization problem is, how do we forecast demand? Or how do we do equipment maintenance? Do we buy new equipment or do we lease it? All those optimization problems, they all have different assumptions, and they would have strategic assumptions, they would have operational assumptions, they would have cyber assumptions, financial, and so on. So if we're thinking in the mindset of risk management too, risk management is a decision-making tool. There's no differentiation between strategic risk, like the strategic and operational risk don't even exist as the concept, because all it exists is that you have decisions, you have assumptions that go into their decisions, and assumptions come from all over the place. And then you have the optimizing problem, where you have to make the best balance between risk and reward. So to me, it's not a question that you would ever face if we were doing like risk management properly, because we don't really deal with entities like strategic, operational, cyber, or financial risk to begin with. That's my controversial take on the problem. That's why I don't see any difference between. I don't. In my view of the world, strategic risk management doesn't exist, and operational risk management doesn't exist. It's basically just applying risk management to a decision that happens to be at the strategic level. It still has all the inputs from all the operational assumptions anyway. So what's the point?
Yeah, I think that's true. I totally go along with that. I think one of the things that you will need to do at some point is sort of draw boxes around collections of uncertainties and outsource them to people who are qualified to assess them and control them.
Yeah.
And at that point, but again, I think it's a very nice point, and it sort of takes us back to the earlier point we were saying, where people were doing sort of strategy and risk management the wrong way around. They were making choices and then doing risk management. I think this is similar in the sense that what people do is they sort of presuppose the categories of risk and then do the risk analysis. But actually what you should be doing is doing the uncertainty analysis and then using that to understand how to make the categories. So, you do the uncertainty analysis and then you say, okay, these are lumped together, not because there's something inherently, different about them, but because there's a bunch of people who are eminently well qualified to be able to, assess those risks and control those risks.
Yeah. You've put it very nicely. And I mean, if we were to, really dumb down risk management, it's basically working with assumptions. Risk management is about drilling down and understanding what the assumptions, where they come from, and do we trust them, and do we need to add volatility to the assumptions. It's really because we don't really manage risks. We make decisions using the risk information. Maybe we're managing assumptions. I mean, I do not want this to be, our widespread message. But I'm just saying that it's not really about managing risks, and it's not really about having strategic risk management or operational risk management. It's about optimization decisions that utilize some of the decision science or probability theory that we have in our foundation of risk management. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Any last thoughts, or again, opportunity to everyone who's been very patient with us, and thank you again for sticking around. Last opportunity to ask questions. Any last thoughts from you, Graham?
No. I think we've covered a lot of really useful material. I think it's been extremely interesting, very enjoyable discussion. I hope we can do it again sometime.
So thanks, Graham. And last thought from me: none of this stuff is fundamental new. Read the books. We've given you the sources. Some of the tools that we've been discussing are not that complex, and some of the tools you don't even have to use yourself. I mean, sometimes it's just about pushing a little bit and nudging the strategic department to change their game and stop hiding certain things that they've been hiding for years. Give them that voice or the courage to highlight the uncertainty in the decision making. So it's not too complicated. It requires a little bit of homework and a little bit of courage. And if you need help, you can always reach out to Graham on LinkedIn or myself on LinkedIn, and we'll be happy to help you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.